Thank you all for joining us today for TCU Presents A History to Remember. As the title of one of the TCU Press books suggests, TCU indeed has a remarkable story to tell as we celebrate our university's history. Today we have an audience watching from across the country, and we look forward to reading your comments later on in the presentation. Joining me on the panel today are three distinguished people whose work on TCU's history has been invaluable. Abigail Jennings. Abby is the TCU Press production manager and one of the primary editors for A Remarkable Story to Tell. She's also a 2020 TCU graduate. After 40 years at TCU, 40, think about it, Phil Hartman is Dean Emeritus of the College of Science and Engineering, and he is the person primarily responsible for updating Joan Hewitt Swain's wonderful 1992 book, Walking TCU. And Frederick Gooding, Dr. G, as he is known, is a core faculty member in the John V. Roach Honors College, and for the first 3 years, he directed TCU's Race and Reconciliation Initiative. Today, he will talk about his work as one of the primary editors for A History to Remember, TCU in Purple, White, and Black. I am proud to be here with these three talented editors. For the past dozen years, I have served as the director of TCU Press, which has recently published 5 books that in various and unique ways have contributed to TCU's remarkable story. Through the publication of digital and bound books, TCU Press enhances and expands TCU's core mission of discovering, developing, and disseminating knowledge by publishing relevant and innovative scholarly and creative titles. For the past few years, it has a rich history worth telling, TCU, and in a few instances, worth updating. The first of 5 Sesquicentennial books at TCU Press, Images and Stories of TCU's First 100 Years, tells TCU's story from 1873 to 1973, offering an engaging assortment of images and anecdotes to highlight TCU's first century. For example, most readers will be surprised to learn that at one time, TCU had its own campus airport, and inevitably, its own plane crash on campus. Edited by Professor of History and Director of the Center for Texas Study, Gene Smith, and History PhD candidate Jackson W. Pearson, Images and Stories was published in February in collaboration with the Center for Texas Studies. Also published last spring, A History to Remember, TCU in Purple, White, and Black, is a timely and relevant book. Building on their work for the Race and Reconciliation Initiative, Dr. G and his co-editors, Sylvianne Greensward and Marcellus Perkins, trace the history of Blacks and racial prejudice at TCU. Their work tells a story that urgently needed telling, and it is a story of how TCU at times has struggled to live up to its values and to practice what it preaches about diversity, equity, and inclusivity. The new and updated edition of Walking TCU was published last April, and in 3 decades since the original edition, the university has renovated nearly every building on campus and erected nearly 60 new buildings, 30 of which went up in one remarkable 5-year period. Mostly affectionately, students, faculty, and staff have referred to TCU as Texas Construction University. To document TCU's new campus, Phil accomplished a prodigious amount of work in a remarkably short period of time and produced an exceptionally beautiful book. The 4th Sesquicentennial book, A Hope of Wisdom, is also an update. In 1973, as part of its centennial celebration, TCU Press published the original, A Hope for Wisdom, as a special numbered and signed gift book with essays on education by Joseph Addison Clark and Chancellor James M. Mowdy. This new 2023 edition replicates the original but adds an essay on education by Chancellor Victor Boschini. offering his views on TCU's mission to educate individuals as ethical leaders and responsible citizens in the global community. The fifth and final TCU Press Sesquicentennial book is A Remarkable Story to Tell, TCU 1973 to 2023. And it is remarkable not only because it describes TCU's growth and progress from being a small regional school beset with enrollment and budget problems to becoming a prestigious nationally and internationally recognized university, but also because the story is literally told by hundreds of people. The narrative of TCU's rise is constructed from over 140 interviews of campus members who played a role in shaping the university, and as well incorporates voices and images from such TCU publication as TCU Magazine, The Skiff, and TCU Yearbook. By letting so many campus members tell the TCU story, the book highlights one of the university's most central and enduring values, its inclusive and connected community. I'd like to thank the TCU Alumni Association, TCU Magazine, and the Office of Social Media Management for coming together to produce this special session of TCU Presents. I'm honored to further introduce today's panelists. Dr. Phil Hartman recently retired after 40 years of service and commitment to TCU. During this time, he taught biology courses, directed TCU's Distinguished Pre-Health Professions program for 22 years, and for 7 years served as the Dean of the College of Science and Engineering. But Phil did not retire. He merely exchanged chair and provost meetings with adventures in the library's special collections and an intensive writing schedule. His authorship continues as he is now working on a new book on TCU's campus. He can say more about it. Also joining us on the panel is Dr. Frederick Gooding Jr., Dr. G, an associate professor of history and the Dr. Ronald E. Moore Endowed Professor of the Humanities in the John V. Roach Honors College. Dr. G provided great service to the university as the inaugural chair of TCU's Race and Reconciliation Initiative. But even before this, he had already started working on a book on the history of TCU's Black experience. He has been quoted in the New York Times, Time Magazine, and USA Today, and he has appeared on CBS, NBC, and Fox News, critically analyzing images within mainstream culture and engaging audience on racial patterns, quote, hidden in plain sight. A 2020 TCU graduate, Abigail Jennings, is the TCU Press production manager and is one of the primary editors for A Remarkable Story to Tell. Multi-talented, Abby is an accomplished violist, and her group, the Bluebird Quartet, recently returned from a performance in the Midwest. While at TCU, in recognition of her talents as a writer, she was awarded the Sandra Brown Excellence in Literary Fiction Scholarship. In addition to her service as a production manager and editor, she is currently working on a historical novel. Abby waved to the crowd.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome especially everyone watching online. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and we will try to answer them as we go along. If not, Abby will play her viola. So the first question is for the three panelists. Could be difficult, could be easy. When you are walking TCU, what are your favorite campus areas and why do you enjoy them? Phil, would you want to go first?
Sure. Well, and I would think that has changed through the years because, of course, the campus has changed radically through the years. But right now, I would say a walk down the campus commons to the blue is probably my favorite walk. I get to see Frog Fountain. I get to see the football stadium in the background. And I get to reflect in part on how TCU has really changed in those 40 years that I've been a part of the institution.
Dr. G?
It would have to be the fountain. And I know it's iconic, and I know so many people refer to the fountain, but for me, it really does symbolize this idea of connectivity. I really like the symbology embodied in the four different plumes and how it just tells the story of continual evolution and change, right? From the first year student all the way to a senior, but also just this idea that we're not talking about four steps, but just this large idea of progression. And I think that for many students who come here and talk about the experience that they've had, many talk about this idea they came in one way and they left a certain way. And I think that Frog Fountain and the continuous flow of water just really symbolizes that. And especially when you have 40 plus days of triple digit heat, that fountain comes in quite handy as well.
Thank you, Dr. G. Abby?
My favorite part of campus is the grassy area and the big oak trees in front of Jarvis and Walsh. While I was a student at TCU, this place always gave me a sense of grounding and quiet, being in nature. And spending time there was a way to connect with the outdoors and something bigger than studying or myself. Now that I'm a staff member, I still like that part of campus, partly because of my fond memories there, but also because there are always students walking by on their way to class. And working in a part of campus that isn't always student facing, it's nice to be surrounded by the energy of learning and camaraderie that the students have and that is central to working at a university. While editing A Remarkable Story, I learned that those trees are actually not native to the TCU landscape. There is a photo from the early 1900s when the first 4 buildings on campus had just been built, and there isn't a single tree. It was literally just a prairie. Those trees were planted because the university leaders wanted the campus to be a beautiful place to learn.
Let me just throw one, because I was reflecting on this when I was first interviewed for Walking TCU. And in fact, my favorite place on campus is the 5th floor of Winton Scott, which is where my office and research laboratory was. And it was my favorite place because that's where I most connected with students. So there are beautiful places on campus, but I think the connection that we've referred to a number of times really is between individuals. And I think probably as different people reflect on that, they would see that their favorite spots ground to probably where they spent a lot of time on campus.
Great. Thank you all. I'll start out with some specific questions for specific people. And Phil, your first question. How long had you been kicking around the idea for updating Walking TCU before coming to TCU Press with your idea? And what motivated you to hop into this project?
Well, I'll start by saying that I've long been a sucker for campus architecture. As I would go to scientific meetings at different universities and colleges, I would take the opportunity to walk campus. And so I've liked that in general. And then I would also say that since it was published in 1992, Joan's book, which is entitled Walking TCU, and of course, you can actually take this book with you and walk campus. So I've always loved that book. And as time went on, I thought, well, this might be the opportunity, especially with the Sesquicentennial approaching, to do an update, which morphed into something that probably you wouldn't want to walk campus with, but you can use as a guide to walk campus. So I would say that the project's probably been ruminating for maybe 10 years or so, but then in an active format, probably for about the last 4 years.
Great. One more question, Phil. We would be remiss in not mentioning Joan Hewitt Swaim and her original Walking TCU. Her name is listed along yours as an editor. How was working with Joan, and what does she think of campus now as opposed to the way it looked 30 years ago?
Well, I would say, first of all, it was a joy to work with Joan and actually reconnect with her and also get to meet her daughter, Susie, who helped out on the project quite a bit. Unfortunately, Joan's eyesight has failed considerably. Her mind is sharp as a tack. Her wit remains just absolutely delightful, but she's really not able to come on campus and see anything anymore owing to her failing vision. But she was able to draw on memories, and those memories go way back because Joan was actually raised on campus. Her father was a longtime professor and was actually my predecessor's predecessor in terms of chairing the Pre-Health Professions Advisory Committee. So it was really fun to work with Joan, and had a number of delightful interactions with her throughout the course of this project.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Dr. G, I have a couple of questions for you. We've talked about the physical changes to TCU over the past 30 years. What have been you able to learn about culture at TCU and how it has changed over 150 years, especially in terms of inclusivity?
Certainly. Well, in working on the project entitled History to Remember, TCU in Purple, White, and Black, along with Dr. Sylviane Greensword and Marcellus Perkins, what we learned is that TCU has always had a connection to diversity. It's not as if this is something that is brand new or came out of thin air, but the question is, how deep has that connection been, right? And how consistent has it been, right? We were able to learn that there were non-white students, on campus from before the quote unquote period of integration, because the hallmark date for integration refers to African American students, right, in 1964. From this day henceforth, that's the date of the memo that was signed by Sadler. And so what we wanted to do is see if there's more to the story, and indeed there is. And so I think the question is how we define diversity comes into play in terms of looking outside the black-white binary, and also this idea of is it truly diverse if you have just a small smattering of students versus a larger contingent that can truly be integrated as part of the student population. And so even when we look at like the first dates of when, say, African American students were brought on campus, the question is were they truly integrated and accepted? And so I think this idea of, instead of looking for pinpoint dates, just trying to understand the flow of time, just trying to understand how TCU has continued to evolve. So I think, the long answer to your question is that I think that there's, when we look at the story of TCU when it comes to diversity, I think it's a work in progress, right? And as it should be. I think the university's work is never done in that regard. There's always something to learn. And so when it comes to contextualizing a bit more the African-American lens, hopefully this story in this book will help contribute towards that conversation.
Great, thank you. Another question. How much more inclusive has TCU become since 2020 in light of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned George Floyd because I haven't heard his name in the news much lately, right? It seems as if that happened way long ago in 2020. And so many institutions, TCU included, felt the compulsion to react or do something in the face of something that was so horrific, and also ripped the scab off and reminded us of the work that we still need to do, right? For many people who maybe had looked at the election of Obama in 2008 as the high watermark of, okay, well, we're moving things along. Maybe perhaps we're in a post-racial society. Well, I think George Floyd disabuses us of that notion in terms of reminding us that latent tensions still remain and we still have to work on them. And so in the summer of 2020, in the aftermath of the summer social uprising, the Board of Trustees agreed to create the Race and Reconciliation Initiative, which was an initiative designed to study TCU's relationship with slavery, racism, and the Confederacy. And as you had mentioned earlier, I had had a book contract with TCU Press beforehand, like many months, almost a year prior. And I guess I can partially blame you, Dan, for this, because when I first came to TCU in 2018, I was given a gift of several books, talking about TCU from TCU Press, of which I was very appreciative. But in looking at the books, I just, you have to forgive me. It's a habit of mine, but I just look at life through the lens of African-American male, right? I mean, that's just the body I'm in, right? And so having that lens and looking at all the information and learning about TCU and just wanting to be a part of the community, right? I just was still just wondering whether there was more to the story when it came to the African-American experience, right? Outside of contributions, say, on the football or basketball field, right? And so in terms of since then, the research that was commissioned by the initiative, I think, was very, very helpful in helping to make more common, this conversation of, well, how do we deal with our past? Because some of the chapters of our past are dark and embarrassing. I mean, there's no way around it. But at the same time, I think by embracing the history and not erasing it, what we do is we put ourselves in a position to tell a phenomenal story, right? When you look at our trajectory and look at our ability to be able to move from A to B, right? In terms of change over time, this idea that we're not locked or we're stuck in, the problematic patterns of the past, but this idea that we have the opportunity to evolve. And I think through the initiative and through the work that has come through that, with this book being I guess a byproduct of that, I think that's what gives me the most hope and encouragement when we talk about how much more inclusive has TC become. I mean, I think that on the ground, if you talk to students, many might question, well, what has truly changed? I know statistically numbers are improving and changing, but I think when you look at, just the overall attitude, demeanor, and culture, and the idea that there's more receptiveness to having this conversation, I mean, that's something that we absolutely have to work with and continue to build upon. And I just want to shout out for all those who are tuning in all the way from Mexico to New Jersey, and being in New Jersey, of course, you're Eagles fans and not Giants fans. I just want to let you know that for those who are in the area, feel free to join us. Because there will be a book talk on the 20th of September if you would like to learn more about this particular aspect of the TCU story.
Thank you, Dr. G. Great comments. It's a wonderful book, and it is still in its launch phase. Although it did come out a little early. We thought it would come out later, and it appeared in April. What has been the feedback so far about the book?
Well, so far, we've been overwhelmed over how positive the feedback has been. As you mentioned, we did a soft book launch in the summer, this past summer, at Doc's Bookstore. It's the only African-American bookstore that we are familiar with in the Fort Worth area. And so we launched around Juneteenth. And just with the city of the size, of course, you're going to have competing events. And Brian Stevenson, of all people, he's the author of Just Mercy, the movie starred Michael B. Jordan. The book is better. And so he had an event that night, for Opal Lee, and they're doing the Juneteenth Museum. So, we're thinking, oh, well, at least the three of us can talk to each other and the book owner, right? Well, it turns out it was standing room only, right? And I guess what that shows us is that there are numerous members of our community that want to connect with TCU, not just on campus, but off campus, and want to know more and want to learn more about the story. And so again, we've been very consistent in saying that it's not the end all be all. There's so much information to cover, uncover and discover, but at the very least, we feel good about contributing to this conversation that hopefully will continue to evolve.
One quick final question. We've mentioned Sylviane and Marcellus. Can you comment briefly on their contributions to the project?
Absolutely. So Dr. Sylviane Greensward was the postdoctoral fellow for the Race and Reconciliation Initiative. She now is a colleague in the Honors College, right? And Mr. Marcellus Perkins started off as a graduate student and is on his way to becoming a PhD candidate quite soon here at TCU in the School of Education. And so the good news is that when good people come together to do good work, good things often happen. And so, and in leading this charge of how do we just get people talking and connecting over this concept of reconciliation, it was clear, just within seconds, actually, of just how brilliant these two individuals were. And so, what I decided to do was rip up the book contract and add them on, because many hands make the load light, and also oftentimes. As smart as we all are, I mean, we can't do everything by ourselves, and so I just had this instinct that by adding in these additional perspectives, it would only make the project improved and better as a result. And I think I think I was right in that the contributions absolutely just demonstrate this idea that when people have the opportunity to shine, that that's exactly what they will do. And so I think for anyone who's curious, it's not a matter of someone's been a scholar in the field for 35 years, then that's the criteria by which I will pick up their book and read what they have to say. No, I mean, I think these burgeoning scholars have demonstrated that they have a voice, and I think it just goes along with this larger idea of not only sharing the story of African Americans and their footprints and their fingerprints with TCU, sharing that story and that voice, but also just this larger idea of Black voice itself, in terms of three authors being able to contribute to a conversation that, if you go to your local library, is actually not that diverse. What do I mean? As an African American historian, I am in the minority as an African American historian, if that makes any sense, meaning that most of the books of African American history are not written by people who look like me, right? And it's not to say they're not good works. It's not to say that they're not accurate, but it's just to say that, ironically, many of our voices are missing from this conversation. And so I think, with this enterprise, to be able to add their voices to this conversation has been an absolutely plum-pleasing pleasure and awesome to behold and marvel.
Great, thank you. Abby, couple questions. Not to spoil anything people might read in the book, but can you start off by telling us your favorite part in A Remarkable Story to Tell?
A Remarkable Story is a really big book with a lot of different parts, and so it's hard to pick one favorite. But in addition to the text, there are numerous photos that accompany the words and demonstrate the change that TCU has experienced over the last 50 years. And I would say that one of my favorite aspects is seeing the change through the photos. For example, the photos of the library, how the library has evolved from when it was built in the 1920s and all of its various stages of renovation, the card catalogs to the computers. Then there's a section on TCU then and now that contrasts TCU in the 1970s and TCU today. And that shows move-in and the student union, the aerial view of campus. So that's pretty neat because the change is just so dramatic. In addition to the photos, I really enjoy some of the interview excerpts that are included in the book. This book was in part based on the TCU Oral History Project, where students interviewed about 130 or 140 people on campus who had experienced the change that TCU witnessed in the past 50 years. And getting to read their words in the transcripts and how they perceived the change and what they saw as staying the same was really interesting.
Great, thank you. I have to say my favorite part of the editorial process was sending it off for printing. Couple more questions. Can you really say something about what the editorial process was like for you? And what did you learn about TCU that you did not know before and that might have surprised you?
As I mentioned before, this book consists of different sections, and two main ones are a narrative of TCU's history from the 1970s to the present, and that is complemented by an oral history of the university over the last 50 years. The writing and editing process of the narrative was fairly traditional for a history, and that involved lots of research and then many drafts. The editing process for the voices and images section, which is the part that was based on the oral history, was pretty unique. We had 1,500 single-spaced pages of transcripts, and from those we had to pick which topics we wanted to cover. And some topics we searched for, we knew we wanted to include them. Other topics we kept seeing come up again and again in the interviews, and we knew we needed to include those. So once we picked the topics, we had excerpts from the interviews that supported all of these different areas of change at TCU. And then we edited those transcription excerpts generally to get rid of verbal filler that would not be readable as a written publication. So that was the general editing process. Then the design element is very important in this book as well, because we wanted to merge word and image. So this book includes over 400 images, and it is meant to be visually engaging. So during the proofreading process, there was significant editing of the design as well to make sure that it came out the way we had envisioned it. In terms of what I learned so much. As a student, I had no idea everything that went on in administration and leadership, and I did not know that much about the history of the university either. So that was pretty neat to learn more about my university. A couple of the stories that I thought were particularly interesting were the story about how Chancellor Ferrari created the mission statement. They had a retreat where they got a bunch of people together and had to put in a ton of work just to create the one sentence mission statement. So that was an interesting story. I also enjoyed learning how the Honors College was created and the vision behind that, and how I've seen that vision turn into a reality that I experienced. Similar with Frog Camp. Barbara Herman explained how and why she created Frog Camp, and I've gotten to see that come to life and fulfill what she was trying to do.
Great, thank you. One more question. What was it like working with a team on Remarkable Story?
The editing team for A Remarkable Story was large. It consisted of Peggy Watson, who was the founding dean of the John B. Roach Honors College, Leo Munson, the retired associate provost, you, Dan, an honors professor and director of the TCU Press, Mark Wasenick, who was a TCU alum from the class of 1964 and student body president, who has been involved at TCU since, Sarah Horning, a graduate student in English, and 5 undergraduate students, and myself. So we brought a wide variety of skills and experience at TCU, and honestly just life experience together that enabled us to take on such a comprehensive task as writing a history of the university. For me personally, it was a great opportunity to work with elders whom I greatly respected and to work with them as peers. So I never would have anticipated that I would be on an editing team with the founding dean of the Honors College or a retired associate provost, but it was pretty neat to get to work with them. And honestly, we learned from each other because we all had different skills that we brought. And so I'm glad that I have gotten to know these members of the editing team.
Great, thank you. Phil, go around the room again. What did you enjoy most about writing or contributing to Walking TCU?
Well, if I could offer two, one of them was the archival research that I spent in the library in the reference section, digging through old skiffs and old TCU magazines. And so I started in about 1990 and went through all of them. And I have to thank the reference librarians for hauling them forward for me to see. It was actually a physical labor as much as anything else. But there were so many rabbit holes, fun rabbit holes to go down. If you know the people, of course, the book is about buildings, but if you know the people, you would see pictures of a very young Dan Williams, for example, extremely young Dan Williams, or extremely young Phil Hartman, or there's a favorite picture I have of one of my younger son, who's actually, his grandson is now a freshman at TCU, first year student, sorry, at TCU. He was walking to UCC daycare, and I was taking him to daycare. And so that appeared on the front of the skiff in, I think, 1996 or 1998. So again, the first one was just revisiting memories, most of them enjoyable and fond memories from the 40 years or so that I was at TCU. The second was the writing style in this book is very different than anything I'd ever done before. So I am by trade a geneticist, and scientists, I think in general, are writing in a very terse style, in a style that's fraught, if you will, with jargon. And to be able to write and as a part of this sort of emulate Jones', I think, delightful style of writing was, I wouldn't say it was a challenge, but it was a pleasure. And one of my goals was to really make the second edition of the book feel like the first edition. And again, that's a very deliberately different style, if you will, of writing than if you write for a genetics journal or a microbiology journal or a scientific journal in general. So those were, I think, two fun parts of it. Oh, I had the third, working with you, Dan. What can I say?
Thank you. Dr. G, I've already asked about Sylviane and Marcellus, but can you tell us a little more about your teamwork and your background with them before the book, and then how it changed through writing the book?
So in terms of the individuals that I worked with, I also need to, like Phil, shout out the awesome librarians. I mean, Mary Saffel in particular, absolutely awesome in helping us, access the archival sources, because that was a key source of information for us, right? This idea of all we literally had to do was cast down our buckets where we were, as far as the school newspapers, the school yearbooks gave us a lot of information about how TCU was seeing itself, right? And particularly how students saw, their campus environment and what they thought was fit to print, right? So that was quite revealing and eye-opening. So again, it's not what I thought, it's what we found, and just wanted to, just analyze what we found, right? And so, and again, and Tracy Hull was quite supportive of library staff, chipping in. But I guess my relationship with Dr. Greensford and Mr. Perkins only deepened, right? I mean, we had a very collegial, comfortable working relationship, working on the initiative. And the idea was that once we saw just how much information that there was, just with the blessing of the provost, Teresa Dahlberg, she was very much supportive and on board this idea of, how do we create scholarship and make the most out of, these windows of opportunity. And so, while we were just looking at all this data and information we were culling, the relationship that I had with them only deepened as we continued to just figure out a way to showcase and highlight the stories, and we all had different strengths and abilities that we brought to the table. I mean, Mr. Perkins, God bless his soul, actually ventured out, to Jarvis Christian, which is, not around the corner. It's about, 90 minutes away or so. But just to make that connection and make sure that there was no stones that were unturned, and talking about the relationship that TCU had with Jarvis. I won't reveal, but it's in the book in terms of understanding that relationship deeper. And Dr. Greensword, completed, I don't know, about 3,000 oral history interviews, which was amazing. And, used that information as a way to not only cull information, but also help TCU on the larger front, reestablish connections with many alumni, right? Because, and that's what we want to do on the 20th of September, by the way, is showcase some of the living alumni. So you'll be relieved. It won't be me just, blowing hard over a microphone the whole time. You'll actually listen to the people who actually made the history, right? Which is, I think, what people want to see and hear. But I think through those oral history interviews, what it did was, I think, reminded alumni, especially particularly African-American alumni, that their stories mattered, and that their experiences mattered, and that, they're a valuable part of this larger TCU fabric, right? As opposed to, I got through this experience, I didn't really fully enjoy it, and don't ask me for money, right? As opposed to that, this idea that we're now able to say, no, you're part of this TCU story. We want to tell the story, and how do we go about, reconciling, this relationship, right? So, I mean, again, bringing those skills to the table, I think were absolutely important. And so I think it's only, deepened, and hopefully will only continue to grow.
Great. Thank you. We need to transition to the next part of the program and answer some chat questions. But Abby, can you quickly say something of what it was like to work with the student editors and their contributions?
The student editors were a critical part of the team for this book. They chose excerpts, they picked photos and wrote captions. They put in a ton of hard work, and they're absolutely our colleagues in this project, and we're so grateful to have their help.
Okay, thank you. We do have a few questions from the wide audience. The first, what key developments will be in the 2023 version of A Remarkable Story? Abby, do you want to start with what you think are the key developments in TCU's history for the past half century?
Whoever asked that question, I encourage you to read the book. But one of the big changes on campus is the physical change of the landscape. It has grown immensely. The number of buildings in the last 20 years, it's just the last 20 years is a huge difference. The academic standing has improved, the level of scholarship, the number of students who want to come here is much, much greater. It used to be that it was open enrollment, and anybody pretty much who met the minimum SAT requirement could get in. Now we have thousands more applicants than spots available. Sports teams have improved. I mean, just across the board, TCU has changed so much, and that's why we call it a remarkable story. So read the book.
Thank you, Abby. Certainly, Chancellor Bill Tucker and his administrative team had a vision 50 years ago about what TCU could become, and monetizing the oil revenue and putting it into the endowment was really an incredible first start to TCU's growth. I'm not sure of the exact figures right now, but it was something, the endowment was something like 53 million when Bill Tucker started. And when he retired, it was somewhere around 650 million. So that is really a remarkable step in its growth. In the book, and I know people will read it, Dr. Phil Hartman is quoted as saying one of the most immense changes on campus has been technology. We've gone through an incredible technological revolution. What we're doing right now is an example of something that would have been unheard of even 20 years ago. So there's many wonderful stories. Dr. Hartman has a question. What was the most unexpected change at TCU during the last 30 years?
Well, I could start with athletics, because when I first came to TCU, the first football game I went to, TCU played UTA. That's the one in Arlington and not Austin. They don't even have a football game anymore. And as I remember, the score was 24-21 TCU, which sort of reflects how far we've come, I think, in terms of football. So, and I would say not only football, across the board in terms of athletics, but putting that important part of our culture aside, I think the increased scholarship across the board, to me, has been a wonderful development for TCU. When I first got here, we certainly had scholars, but frankly, they didn't exist in as numerous a form as they do now. So I think that the breadth of scholarship that occurs at TCU, I think, has really been an unexpected and a very pleasant change. And then the final thing, if I can go back to sort of the walking TCU and thinking about buildings, all of the new buildings are nice and they're beautiful and they're stunningly new. That sounds redundant, I suppose. But I think equally, if not more important, have been the remodeling, the reshoring to the current buildings. And if I'll use Winton Scott, my old haunt, as an example, that building was really in pretty decrepit state when I first got here. My research laboratory was very state of the art if you wanted to live in the Eisenhower era. And the series of renovations that occurred in a very deliberate fashion at quite some expense, I think, really facilitated the ability for faculty to be teachers and scholars. So I would say renovation of existing buildings has been very unexpected and a pleasant surprise.
Great. Thank you.
And along those lines, I mean, Phil, just to echo what you're saying, let's not overlook Sadler Hall in the renovations. I think with Judy and Paul Andrews in terms of their donations with the Honors College, and to take such a historic building, from the outside, with the ionic columns and whatnot, and to still have it state-of-the-art, technologically sound on the inside, I think shows TC's ability to flow with time, right? This idea that we're still preserving, the look and feel that, so many alumni appreciate when they come back to campus, in terms of recognition, this is familial to me. But at the same time, when, our current students and their current needs, are coming to campus, they're still feeling as if they are able to feel comfortable and still be able to be productive, in an environment that, they feel reflects, just who they are right now. So who knows what the buildings will look like 50 years from now? Will we even have books in our library? That's another question for another time. But going to what you're saying, Phil, there's numerous places on campus that are not only new, but also, trying to get with the new.
Dr. G, you have a question about some of the things you've learned. What was learned about TCU's past regarding race? Some things that surprised you, that shocked you, or that made you feel good?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Dan, I think you had some. Yeah. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What I learned, one of the things I learned that I would like to share with you is that when we talk about history, there's two, shall we say, principal categories that we like to distill everything down to, right? Either primary source documents or secondary, right? Source documents, right? And so Secondary source are what many people are familiar with when they encounter history, meaning that it might be a textbook that summarizes and distills. Here's what happened. Here's some dates, or even just some of the books that we're printing right now, TCU Press, right? This idea that here's an account, but primary source documents. This is where the gold is, and this is what maybe as many people aren't as familiar with, because it takes a little bit more time and effort to access them. Because they're they're protected, they're fragile. But the idea is that they're so very valuable to us because what they're done is primary source means that the individual, like I myself, Randolph Clark, wrote this letter, right? Is dated, in the 19th century. I mean, here's my signature, like I created this. So rather than us speculating or using our best guess to figure out what happened, the idea is that we're able to actually let the document speak for itself. So I say that to say, in looking at the primary source documents, what I was reminded of was that ordinary people have the opportunity to make extraordinary contributions to our history. And what do I mean? Well, what do I mean is that the reason why the people who shall we say received the most amount of face time in our book, well, these are the people who just really took the time to record what they were thinking and feeling at that moment. They were ordinary people at the time, maybe not thinking that, years from now, this is going to be, so important and famous, but they took the time to record their thoughts and ideas. And that is so very valuable to us today, right? And so what that reminds me of is how we, in this moment in time, especially for students that may be listening, right? This idea that there's a presumption that, again, it's always older people, it's always so far away that, in terms of the people who have the ability to create history. No, the idea is that students right now have this power to intersect, interface, engage, and also create history. And when we look at, and again, I'm just giving a snippet and I'll be quiet, but when you look at the individuals that we chronicle that helped, for example, Martin Luther King become a recognized holiday on campus, because part of the history is that wasn't always the case, right? And students had to be vocal and active and saying, hey, this is the right thing to do. In retrospect, of course, it was the right thing to do. We thank the students. But at that time, they were just normal students who were going to class and receiving a lot of flack, right? And so, it is now in retrospect, we admire them and we're going to give them their flowers. But right now, many students have that same ability to speak up and stand up for what they believe in. And time will tell, which side of history that they were on. But the fact that they have a voice and have a story to tell, I think that's what I'm reminded of most with a project like this.
Thank you. We have a question about the library and Mary Couts Burnett. Can you talk about Mary Couts Burnett, who is still a huge contributor, the Burnett family, to TCU? The largest gift just came recently from the Burnett Foundation for $50 million for the medical school. I love Mary Couts Burnett. I had my picture taken next to her silhouette photograph in the library because I like her so much. And for those who don't know the story about Mary Couts Burnett, please go to the library, ask any of the librarians, or email Tracy Hull, Dean of the Library, and they will regale you with some colorful facts about what happened. But basically, to more or less spite her estranged husband, she sued for half of his inheritance and won in court, and then proceeded to donate that money to a small, struggling university at that time. And there's at least one anecdote that the then chancellor, when he saw the amount the university was going to receive, started dancing in his Sadler office.
And I would add, I think it's not unlikely that TCU would not exist without that gift, because that carried the institution in part through the Depression era. And it was a time when, for example, over about a 2-year time period, faculty took a 43% reduction in their salaries. And so the times were very difficult. We think about the COVID times as being hard, and I don't want to diminish the anguish of COVID as an infectious agent and what it can cause. But in terms of the financial impact, those were very difficult times when TCU was a very, very small institution with 1,500 students or something like that.
Yep. And, just to add on to that comment by Phil, that's what's so very fascinating about the history once you learn it, because our leadership has been dominated by males, right? In terms of all of our chancellors and our president, all males, all white, again, good guys, but that's just what it is, right? And so this story reminds us of how TCU may not be the TCU it is without the contribution of the key, woman figure in our TCU community, right? And so it's not just a name on the library, but it's a very important name that means a lot more than what meets the eye, right? And so to understand this dynamic, even though she may not necessarily be on the front lips of everyone who talks about TCU, but to introduce that story and to maybe think about ways in which we can maybe consider retelling that story and positioning it better as students come on campus. I think this is what's exciting, right? This possibility of how we're able to now tell a more holistic story.
Great, thank you, Dr. G. Winding down on the time now, but we have a couple more. What has been the impact of the campus commons? I'll just start out with an anecdote that when I arrived, and as Phil remembers, that was a giant parking lot. The center of campus was a parking lot. And I came out after work one day from my office in Reed Hall and discovered that my pickup truck had been broken into.
I'll go back further. If you wind the clock back a number of decades before, that was the site of a dairy farm. But that's, of course, deep history. I think that the campus commons has provided a venue for the connection of TCU students to one another. Probably not on a day like this when it's so bloody hot out, but quite often you'll see students hanging out, studying, interacting with one another. So it provides that opportunity. It also provides proximity for those residence halls that form an important part. So it is, I think, central to the culture that exists at TCU now.
Dan, just to clarify, when you told that sad story about your truck being broken into, I just hope the assailant wasn't wearing yellow and green from Baylor.
The assailant and I never directly connected, so I can't be sure. But at that time, I was one of many vehicle owners that had a problem on campus. So,
and I will say that the campus was a very different place when I arrived in 1981. It just was not as pretty. There were fire hydrants that were painted purple, but that paint job was probably 10 years out of date. There were rocky spots as you'd walk from one spot to another. So the aesthetics of this campus, and I would shout out that the grounds crew, the guys that work on the grounds crew, are absolutely superb in their absolute love and care that they dedicate to TCU.
Also, isn't it true that when you look at our commons now, as far as the fountain and in the central grass walkway, that we were the architect was inspired by University of Virginia to imitate or emulate that layout?
I've heard that. And I believe it. I haven't seen it written down anywhere, but certainly to have a central green on campus and then to look at other campuses, Virginia among them, was part of the steps in that process. We have one final question. Which era in time was the hardest to find information on?
Who, for which book? You're muted.
Which period of time do you think was the most difficult to research?
I would say for a remarkable story, probably the 1970s, 80s time period was a little bit more difficult, only in the photos, because the photos hadn't all been digitized yet. But other than that, I think it was about equal.
Thank you, and thank you all. Thank you for everyone who has stayed with us. You can read more about Remarkable Story and other TCU Press books in the fall special edition of TCU Magazine at magazine.tcu.edu. TCU Magazine has been a wonderful resource, and it still is an invaluable contribution to campus. Please stay connected with the TCU Alumni Association at alumni.tcu.edu. Thank you all, and go Frogs.
Go Frogs.